Hi, Colleen. Your eclectic taste and deep passion for vinyl, as we can see behind you, means that you seamlessly blend the roles of DJ, producer, remixer, and tastemaker. As a very, very close friend of the legendary David Mancuso and broadcaster of the celebrated Balearic Breakfast, you can ignite a dance floor as well as stoke a passionate online community. Welcome to the House Culture podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Now, we want to dig into all these exciting aspects of your career. However, we always like to start at the beginning and roll it back and understand where you grew up in Massachusetts and, tell us about how you first discovered a love of music from a young age.
I think that's really interesting. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston in a very small kind of normal town that really didn't have any kind of, huge musical connections, nor did it have really people that were really involved in music as professionals in terms of the kinds of music I was listening to. No one was making albums. No one was really in the music scene, including my family, my parents. My parents had more pedestrian tastes,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't really have many records, maybe a few 8 tracks that were soundtracks, and that's it.
No way.
So my love of music is a really strange kind of thing to think about because I've been thinking about it a lot recently too, and I think there's two reasons why I got into music so heavily. Oh, three. I mean, one, there'll be a native kind of part of me that is just
Mm-hmm.
my personality and the way I was born. Another is I grew up with a lot of younger aunts and uncles. My dad was the eldest of six. He was 20 when he had me. We all lived in
Mm-hmm.
the same small town. You couldn't go downtown without seeing a Murphy.
Yeah.
And my aunts and uncles, some of them were teenagers when I was growing up. So I was, hanging out with them because they were so cool to hang out with, or they were giving me records,
Mm-hmm.
or I was borrowing records actually as well from one of my uncles who lived a few doors down from me once I was a teenager. So there was that side as well.
Yeah.
But I would say the third thing, I was very lucky to have really great radio in
Mm-hmm.
Boston because commercial radio in the United States is pretty dire. It's
Yeah.
not as good as the BBC here in the UK. It didn't have the same kinds of sounds. Even though you only
Mm.
had like 4 radio stations over here, Radio One, when the time that I was growing up, was playing really interesting music.
Yeah.
Whereas commercial radio in the States was very much top 40,
Mm-hmm.
country, classic rock. But I grew up outside of Boston, and Boston has the most colleges and universities in the country.
Mm-hmm.
So we had great college radio, but we also had a very cool listenership. So even the commercial stations had to kind of cater to them.
Yeah.
Plus, we had a very rich DJ. We had a very rich band scene in Boston, and the local radio stations would play a lot of local bands as well.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, we had a big Black community, a big Puerto Rican community. We had Kiss 108 was a really great radio station that catered more towards that community, but also people like me listened to it all the time.
Yeah.
So there was a really great wide spectrum of music on the radio itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think all of those things kind of helped forge my early kind of musical proclivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about from that young age as well. It's about having that access to music. People who had the physical copies of things and being able to tune into something that you might not be able to get hold of that music that's being played, but actually being just exposed to it. From decent tastemakers and, like you say, for college radio and things like that. Obviously, you got involved with your high school radio when you were at high school. Is that right?
Yeah, and I was just doing some research on high school radio stations because I thought every town had one. It was a 10-watt radio station.
Yeah.
And in Massachusetts, there were only 19 high school radio stations. And
Wow.
you think there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of towns in
Mm,
Massachusetts.
mm.
And we were one of the lucky towns that had a radio station. It's kind of unbelievable to me. And that was a huge, huge influence on what happened to me and where I went later in life. Because if I
Mhm.
hadn't been on the radio, from the age of 14, I don't know where my life would have been. I wasn't intending on joining the basketball team or the softball team. I was in drama, so
Yeah.
but actually it was also through drama class that I got into really interesting music as well, because there were a few older guys in there
Mhm.
in the drama club that turned me on to really good music, like Lena Lovitch, B-52, Sex
Yeah.
Pistols, Elvis Costello.
Yeah.
So there were a few kind of older guys that were listening to different sounds that most people weren't listening to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was really lucky with the radio station, and that's kind of what then made me a record collector starting at the age of 15. And
Hmm.
then my first job, well, not my first job, I also worked in a grocery store. But when I turned 16, I got a better job at a record shop. So
Hmm.
it just kind of all started moving that way. And I
Yeah.
didn't even intend on having a career in it. It's just kind of kept happening. I kept gravitating towards it and it kept gravitating towards me, I guess.
Yeah, well, the universe is telling you to do something. It's yeah, you must be doing the right
Yeah.
thing. And in terms of that love of music, you moved to New York in 1986, and you were studying sound and radio at NYU Film School. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm for me as a white middle class British kid grew up in the 80s, to think about New York in the 80s is I'm thinking of the melting pot of the art scene, the Paradise Garage, Larry Levan, Keith Haring, Wild Style, all graffiti, all things like that. What Just paint a picture for us what it was like when you first got there, and how much was it a culture shock for you coming from, like you said, a small town in Massachusetts to New York.
Yeah. Well, it was a real culture shock. I'd only been to New York once,
Mm.
and my family didn't even know I had been there because it was me and a bunch of my teenage girlfriends. One of them got their license. They said, "Hey, we're going to Boston," and we drove to New York City. Um, and we're there just for a few hours. And I just remember seeing the huge Keith Haring mural, "Crack is
Mm.
Whack."
Mm-hmm.
Um, I did move there in the middle of an AIDS crisis,
Yeah.
which was hugely prevalent,
Mm.
and a crack epidemic as well.
Yeah.
And but I also moved there at a time of real gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
So the stock market was starting to boom. Very cool neighborhoods were turning into more gentrified neighborhoods with lots of shops and getting so-called cleaned up. It was a
Mm-hmm.
very pivotal time. Um, Coming from Boston, which is kind of a provincial city, really, and
Mm.
it's quite small. I felt like I had kind of done Boston, and that's really the reason I went to school was to get to New York because I had done very, very well in high school, and
Mm.
I got some scholarships, and I was the first person in my family to go to university.
Yeah.
So I didn't take it lightly, and
Yeah.
I picked a place that was in New York and a place that had great radio stations. So, WNYU.
Yeah.
That's how I picked the university because I knew I wanted to do radio,
Yeah.
at least as a hobby. I wasn't sure exactly where I would end up.
Yeah.
But New York it was so great. It was so liberating for me. I mean, I started to meet so many great people, number
Mm-hmm.
one. When you're in a massive city, so many people in the country are gravitating towards New York because they don't fit in where they're from.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was one of those people, and we all kind of found each other.
Mm.
Plus, there was something going on like every single night, or you could just walk around the city, which is what I would do sometimes, just walk around the city
Yeah.
at night. It was kind of like a playground for me.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, there were so many different kinds of music. I never sadly went to the Paradise Garage. It closed in 87 before I was really into that form of music.
Yeah.
But I was going to places like CBGB's and the
Yeah.
Ritz and the Pyramid
Mm-hmm.
Club and then later to in the late 80s to other places like Trax, which was an early house club. And then but it
Yeah.
was really like 1991 when I really started going to clubs very, very heavily. So
Yeah.
I was DJing a bit as I was DJing on the radio, and I DJed at CBGB's Record Canteen and played at Mars once.
Yeah.
So there was some kind of club action, but it was a great place. I mean, it was
Yeah.
exciting, and it wasn't all cleaned up, although the writing was kind of on the wall, but it was still pre-Giuliani,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it just has so much energy.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a buzz
Yeah.
all the time in New
Yeah.
York. It is the city that never sleeps.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and kind of during that era that, for us in the UK, people look at kind of the 80s, mid 80s onwards towards the late 80s is, the acid house explosion in scare quotes there, and that was obviously all being imported over from the US, from Chicago and Detroit, etc. You were obviously in the US in amongst it, hearing, all of this new music with your career on, working on the radio. Did you start to notice this shift towards a more electronic sound and these sounds coming out of these cities, or was it just something that was just happening in the background?
I mean, I was always aware of the electronic sound anyways, because I grew up with the British second invasion.
Hmm.
So I was a huge New Order fan, huge Trevor Horn fan. I mean, there were so many bands that I listened to that they were getting into electronics as well. Plus, I loved Kraftwerk.
Yeah.
And I was also a big, Prince fan too. And even though he did have some of those sounds, um, and some of the artists actually, Stevie Wonder too is bringing in a lot of
Hmm.
different kind of synthesizer sounds and the tonto, he brought that into his work. So that was kind of all around me as I was growing up anyway. So I was kind of taking it in almost by osmosis.
Hmm.
In terms of the whole British scene, I loved what I was hearing from Britain. I mean, I always admired, first of all, how Europeans embraced Black American music more than Americans did. And I was
Yeah.
quite aware of that. And knowing that even like the jazz musicians had a better kind of career over in Europe, and some of them would even settle over here because they just had better opportunities and faced less racism, I suppose.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, still true today because you see
Hmm.
bands like Nile Rodgers Chic and Sister Sledge, they tour here more than they do in America.
Yeah.
So there
Yeah.
still is a greater kind of love, I think, for Black American music over here than there is in the US. Um, but I also loved seeing what was going on in the whole acid house scene, which to me kind of married the indie side. And I remember when Screamadelica came out, I
Hmm.
was producing syndicated radio shows at the time, and I interviewed Bobby
Hmm.
and the band, and I interviewed Aphex Twin, I interviewed Orbital, I interviewed the Orb. So
Hmm.
I always kind of knew what was going on in the UK, whether it was the whole dream pop thing or Map or Saint Etienne or
Yeah. Yeah.
all the Soul to Soul, of course,
Hmm.
so all of those things, I was always really aware.
Yeah.
But, I've always listened to a lot of sounds
Hmm.
and sometimes more fully immersed in certain scenes for whatever reason during certain periods.
Hmm.
And when I started going to clubs in '91, I really, really became a convert and just
Yeah.
dove into it. Even though I was producing these syndicated radio shows in the day and interviewing Nirvana and interviewing the Butthole Surfers and interviewing the Verve and Oasis and all these other bands, I was also interviewing some hip hop artists like Pete Rock, Seal Smooth, and
Yeah.
Gangstar and Das Effects and things like that as well. But I was doing that in the day, and then by night I was going out and collecting other records and started another radio show called Soul School. So,
Uh-huh.
I kind of have always had my hands in lots of different kind of
Yeah.
musical kind of areas, I suppose.
Yeah, completely eclectic. And when you were in New York during that era as well, you worked in dance tracks in a record store. Is that right? When was that? When did that kind of
Yeah.
fit into your time there?
Well, that was more the '90s. So in the
Mm.
'80s, I was on the college radio station. I also worked at Rockpool, which was a trade magazine for kind of more college rock radio DJs and club DJs that were playing more of that kind of Night Reb or kind of Al
Hmm.
Jorgensen wax track sound, which was really big. So that sound was really big as well.
Yeah.
Speaking of electronic music, it just
Yeah.
wasn't as soulful on that side.
Yeah.
It was a little more harsh and
Bit
industrial.
industrial.
But I
Yeah.
loved it as well. I loved that stuff.
Hmm.
And we also even had a little acid house scene there too. There was a really cool little bar called the Milk Bar in the West Village where you could go hear us express, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so there was always, we were always kind of looking towards the UK as well, some of us.
Yeah.
I already forgot the question, so I just kind of go on a ramble.
Yeah, no, don't worry. Dance tracks. I'm just thinking of like
Yeah,
placing you
dance tracks
behind
was
the
the
counter
90s.
there, and what was that like?
Yeah.
What kind of characters were you serving during that era?
Oh, it was so cool. I think Joe asked me to work there starting in 93 or 94. And at first it was part-time because I was doing the syndicated radio shows during the week. And then
Hmm.
that lost its sponsor. And because the radio format had changed, because the
Yeah.
college radio then became commercial radio because of Nirvana. So I started working at Dance Tracks full time. And I said I would only accept if they were doing a label because I had already worked at two record shops.
Mm.
And that's before they started Spiritual Life Music as well. And it
Yeah.
was great because, I met so many DJs. I met so many people. It's where I met Francois. It's where
Hmm.
I met Danny Tenaglia,
Hmm.
my customers. I worked on Mondays um, and closed the shop alone because it was such a quiet day. And
Yeah.
Danny, because he is a very humble man,
We have interviewed him
he'd
on the
work on the
show.
weekends.
He's such a nice
He
guy.
did.
Yeah.
Oh, he is such a nice guy. And so I would save things for him,
Mm.
things that maybe weird stuff from Detroit or the basic channel stuff or just things that wasn't getting sent on promo. Because of
Hmm.
course it was still vinyl
Yeah.
at this time. So people weren't even really playing CDJs or anything like that.
Mm.
And that was great because he trusted my ears and
Hmm.
you develop relationships with these DJs
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
I'd meet people, I'd do mail order with people from all over the United States. I'm going to end up gigging around the States through my network as well. Louis Vega,
Hmm.
he was there. He and Joe had just started doing some work together. He had already put out a couple records,
Hmm.
but this is where he really started to really grow and
Yeah.
evolve as a producer and as a
Hmm.
DJ as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just a great nexus for the community. You could still smoke cigarettes in there. You think about it now, like people come in like smoking cigarettes, so that it was
It's insane.
like really funny. When you think about it now, it's like, gosh,
Yeah.
now it'd be pot, I guess, because pot's legal. So but
Yeah,
we'd get
absolutely.
nothing done. We would have got nothing done. Um, but it was just a great energy, and I'm really happy and lucky to work there. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was a
Great days.
great nexus of the community.
Yeah, yeah, and in terms of that community as well, we have mentioned the name David Mancuso at the top of the intro. He's the man behind the Loft. I've heard, you've described him as a very good friend, a mentor, a major influence on your career. I mean, if we want to talk about the Loft, can you tell us like how you first discovered that party, and what was it like your first attending one of those parties and the kind of crowd and the music that was being played?
Well, I had never heard of the Loft or anything. I've been to the Choice before, like maybe in 1990, which I found out later. Once I went to the Loft, it was held in the same place because David was renting his space out to Richard Vasquez for his people like Larry Levan were playing and
Mhm.
Frankie Knuckles. Um, but I had never heard, I didn't know much about the club world anyways. It was really my friend Alan Stone who was just, he went out every night.
Yeah.
And I actually met him through our shared love of 60s music because he was
Hmm.
also a mod. And also
Okay.
he loved bands like the Style Council, who I loved as well.
Hmm.
He was the one that would start bringing me to dance parties. And I would just go and have a great time and dance, but didn't think too much of it after. I devoted myself to collecting those records. Brought me to quite a few parties. And he said one night, "Oh, let's just go. This is party going on. Let's check it out." I
Mm.
no preamble, knowing nothing about it. And it was not, it's a neighborhood that I lived in as well. But because it's so It's not obvious from the street. There's no
Yeah.
sign. It's David's home. And
Yeah.
because it also wasn't very loud, I never knew it was there. I just walked by it all the time. So I was surprised when I walked up. I was like, oh gosh, I've walked by this place so many times. It was an old theater. And went in,
Hmm.
paid $9.99, and then went to the next set of double doors. And it was just this kind of incredible space that I could tell right off it was somebody's home. You could tell
Mm.
someone was living there. I mean, there was a cat walking around. It was one of the clues. There's a bed in the corner, a kitchen set
Yeah.
up,
Yeah.
and then this kind of mystical looking guy. I mean, I would have been 24. He was
Mm.
48.
Yeah.
So younger than I am now, behind the turntables. And the sound system, even though I didn't know anything about it, nothing.
Mm.
Um, I could tell the sound was just amazing, and I just got turned on to all these great records. The thing with David is he picked music that was great to end
Yeah.
and had a certain kind of life energy to it, and I just picked up on that right away.
Hmm.
Plus, I think I also was into the whole 60s vibe. I mean, David was a hippie, and I
Hmm.
had kind of gone, I had been to Dead shows, I had done all that stuff. I knew all that music. One of my favorite albums is Astral Weeks by and also one of his.
Hmm.
So there was also a shared connection in music without knowing each other, anyways, because that was his basis
Yeah.
before he was, playing records for his party.
Mm.
So that was, and I apparently it was the first time he had reopened. He had taken a hiatus
Okay.
in the late 80s and early
Yeah.
90s. So it was
Mm.
quite a special night, and I started kind of going back all the time. And then David and I befriended one another,
Yeah.
and
The rest is
then it was a
history.
whole other journey because then he asked me to start playing records with him, and we
Yeah.
became more involved professionally. But
Hmm.
the thing I think he was an influence on my career in some way,
Hmm.
um, but in other ways, remember in the 90s, people outside of New York didn't know who David Mancuso was. He held a
Mm.
private party,
Hmm.
and in the 90s, it was not a very successful party.
Hmm.
It didn't have a lot of people going, so it wasn't like it was the talk of the town.
Yeah.
People that were really in the know in like the UK, Japan, and Italy
Hmm.
would know who he was, and that's it.
Yeah.
And really, most Americans didn't. Most New Yorkers didn't.
Yeah.
And the guy that I met was someone suffering financially, and his
Mm.
building had just been stolen out from underneath him. You know, advantage sometimes because the loft is so open and giving. There have been people then and now who take advantage of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so his whole building was stolen out from underneath him. And so he
Oh
was
God.
really, and this is in the middle of the East Village where everything's
Mm.
getting gentrified, and there was no way he was going to move his party out of Manhattan.
Yeah.
So it's then going downsizing to a smaller space in Avenue A.
Yeah.
Then they had to leave that place and downsizing to Avenue B. We were doing fundraisers,
Yeah.
anything we could do to get people in, whether it was my birthday. And, it was just a few of us were just helping David.
Yeah.
And that's why I mentioned the compilation idea to him because I
Hmm.
had just done a mixed CD for Nervous Records in
Hmm.
1998. And, I got paid very little, but it doesn't matter. It was a big breakthrough for me. And I was
Yeah.
very honored to be out, to have a mixed CD out.
Hmm.
But I thought, gosh, if David had done a compilation, he'd get paid properly. It could really help
Yeah.
him. And it
Yeah.
will also get his story out to the world because the
Hmm.
internet's just starting. This
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
1998.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of information about him. There's things that Vince Aletti had written,
Hmm.
also for the Village Voice. And there's
Hmm.
some kind of older documentation that you might be able to find on microfiche at the New. It was literally like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did do a bit of that research actually. So
Wow.
there was no books, there's
Yeah.
nothing else out there. So when I said to him, "Look, why don't you do a compilation? I think you could do very well from it." He said he would only do it with me. And I didn't have a
Yeah.
label, and I was moving to the UK. I'd already made
Yeah.
plans to start moving to the UK.
Yeah.
And that's when I just switched to Newphonic because I had worked with
Yes.
Newphonic through Dance Tracks,
Yeah.
and they
Yeah.
were the right label. And
Yeah.
so we put out the first comp in '99, and that really helped David. He
Mm.
really got recognized internationally. His story came out. He also
Yeah.
started playing around Europe and Japan.
Yeah.
And some of the gigs weren't great, but it still got his name out. Um, but the biggest thing is that it changed him financially.
Yeah.
I mean, he really needed that. And
Yeah.
then even his own parties, because by this time he didn't have his own space anymore. He was renting spaces.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the first time he rented a space was my going away party the night before I left in February
Yeah.
1999, and I had to play. Thanks, David, for my own going away. But it was the first time he rented a space, you know.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And then after that, he started renting spaces. The
Yeah.
parties weren't as frequent; they weren't every week, so
Yeah.
he really had to get people in there, and the compilations helped do that because
Yeah.
all of a sudden older lofties would say, "Oh, the parties are still happening." They
Yeah.
didn't even know. It was so
No
underground,
way.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the way that you call them lofties as well. That's great. It's so cute.
Yeah.
I mean the when you mentioned like playing there, like when you were there was a very specific way that music would be played to an audience there.
Mm.
Like, can you just take us through what the kind of how that was done? Because
Sure.
it's not like a club environment that we're all used to these days. It's a very specific way of
Yeah.
playing records.
Well, sadly, one thing I've noticed, I just want to say this today, is that DJing, some of the new DJ kind of sound is a bit jive to me. Like 2 minutes, mix into the next song,
Yeah, yeah,
and kind of, you know, like there's a real problem with attention. Uh, People have just don't have the same attention levels, and that's a
yeah,
bad thing, and it needs to work.
yeah.
I still play basically the whole song, even when I'm regularly DJing and I'm mixing.
Mhm.
I still
Mhm.
pretty much play the whole thing. I also try to stick to music that's great from beginning to end.
Yeah.
And that was the thing
Yeah.
with David is like he picked songs that would be eternal classics because he had a great ear.
Mm.
He understood the kind of energy levels that a song could give out when it was just kind of a something that's just artifice and concocted and didn't really have the soul. And I can't tell you what that is. This is just a talent.
Yeah.
Just you know it or you don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's no criterion. But he was very good at picking music that uplifted people.
Mhm.
Sound equipment side, this is really where we're getting into how it was so different than normal DJ. Normal DJing, two turntables, a mixer where you can blend two
Mhm.
songs. He used the equipment used, which was this was the scariest part actually of playing records with him, and then later by myself. Was number one, there's no you use a Mark Levinson MO1 preamp,
Mhm.
which has two phono inputs, but you can't you two phone inputs and outputs. But you can't blend the song, so it's just one to the next. It's not a mixer, it's a preamp that has
Yeah.
two phono channels. So that's number
Mhm.
one.
Mhm.
Two, there's no headphone jack. So you have to know the speed and the
Yeah.
cut, and you have to cue it by eye. That's all tricky. But
Mhm.
number three, you're using moving coil cartridges as opposed to moving magnet cartridges.
Yeah.
And moving coil cartridges, number one, are much more expensive
Mhm.
because they're more dynamic, they're more fragile as well. It, it can be such a glorious experience when they're
Mhm.
used properly on the right types of records and treated properly. And David only had two of them, and as I said before, he was broke.
Mm.
And if I had just back cued on one of them or knocked it or looked at it wrong, he would have been down to one cartridge. And
Oh
then
God.
how is he going to do the party? Because it would have been
Yeah.
a lot of money, thousands to replace. And I
Yeah.
don't know if he would have been able to repair it, because it would have to go back to Japan to the people that made them. So that was really, I was surprised that he asked me, because it never crossed my mind that he would ever ask me to do that. Like, it never
Mm.
was even in my head.
Yeah.
Partially probably from a woman as well. And it's
Mm.
just, this is 1992.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was already DJing, but I never even thought I'd have a career as a DJ. It just didn't seem like a possibility. It was just, I'm just doing my stuff, going along
Yeah.
doing my stuff and not really thinking about the future too much.
Yeah.
Uh, but, there were guys that kind of, hanging around trying to be David. And the women never tried to be David. And I
Yeah.
wasn't the first woman he asked either. The first woman was a woman named Freddie Taylor in the 70s. Then he
Uh,
asked my friend Elise Stefanishin, and he always just had a really strong relationship with women.
yeah.
It seemed like I was trust this more. It seemed like he trusted more women than he did men,
Yeah.
because we weren't the ones who were kind of standing there or wanting to be him
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
having favor, because you knew you weren't going to be David, and I've
Yeah.
always felt that way with me. I think earlier, I don't mind saying, you mentioned I was a disciple. I'm not a disciple of David,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
I'm called David, and
Yeah.
everyone's everybody, and
Yeah.
that's that. And I felt in his when he passed away, I did talk about this in his service, is that he didn't want to be revered in that way. He was human.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people that say they use the word Bible and guru and disciple, and that is just not what David would have wanted at all.
Oh,
I mean, that would
yeah.
make him very uneasy. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone.
Yeah.
He was a human being, but an extraordinary human being who
Hmm.
did something basically that nobody else did.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I'm so lucky to have had him in my life. He was like an uncle as well.
Hmm.
He used to refer to me as his daughter. Our friendship was so important to me. I mean,
Yeah.
the mentorship, of course, is wonderful, but it's the friendship really
Yeah.
that's really most important to me.
Yeah. And what was it like in terms of when you moved to the UK, and obviously the Loft Party started coming over here, I think in 2003. Like how was that transatlantic relationship with David working with you being here, him being still in the US, and you're organizing parties here in London? What was the differences in terms of doing a party in the UK versus the
Yeah,
US?
that's a really good question, because David used to say to me, he says, Colleen, you are the only two people in the world who have played records at Precious Hall in Japan, which is Fillmore North, very similar to the Loft. It's the same guy behind Precious Hall.
Mm.
You and I are the only two people that have played the Loft parties here in London and in New York, and they're each different. And this is true even now that we started these Loft inspired parties in Italy just over 10 years ago with friends of David's. The
Mhm.
culture commands,
Yeah.
whether it's the how you do things, the hours, which day of the week, but also musically.
Hmm.
And David also, he understood that people might want to hear their music. So I go
Hmm.
to Italy, I play some Italian songs, and there's certain vibes from places like the Brits love up tempo, really full on, soulful kind of belter.
Yeah.
And in Japan, at 6 in the morning, so deep and minimal that everyone
Hmm.
just really gets. But of course, it's different hours as well. Our
Hmm.
party's a Sunday party, it finishes at midnight. You're
Hmm.
not going to go through the whole long, long winding down that you
Yeah.
would in New York or in Japan. So it's
Yeah.
all different. Well, actually, I
Hmm.
should say the New York parties even changed, because first they were at his house, starting at midnight on Saturday, ending at noon on Sunday.
Hmm.
Then when he started doing Sunday parties, they would finish at midnight or 1. And you just play differently, but the crowds are different. The culture is different, but there's also a lot of things that unify. There's always that common thread as well.
Hmm.
And yeah, it was, really, David was pretty upset when I said I was moving. I think he felt a
Mhm.
bit abandoned. But having said that, we already had the link with the compilation, so that kind of kept us going. Then
Yeah.
we had the party in 2001 at with Newphonic, but David and
Mhm.
I had also started playing together throughout Europe in different places like Italy and where else we played Turkey, Russia.
Yeah.
And then he was doing some touring himself. But the thing that was quite great when we started the parties here together is that he came over to my house 4 times a year as well. So I was the
Mhm.
one because I was the only one he would allow to take care of him, basically, for various reasons.
Mhm.
And yeah, he was over here. And when we bought our own sound system, that's really when I started to learn about audiophile sound and setup.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
had studied sound at NYU, but it was more recording, it
Mhm.
was editing, it was a whole different thing.
Yeah.
This is for playback.
Yeah.
Playback is a whole different thing.
Yeah.
So I learned so much, and just him being here, 4 times records for like a few hours, just
Mhm.
have a whole listening session, and we would listen to music together, and he'd have his running comedy.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, zero interest in what was cool. But
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 that's
he played DFA stuff because it was interesting.
exactly. Yeah.
You know,
And
he had very
it's
open ears.
yeah, it's not that worry about that feeling of an inner embarrassment in terms of like, oh, is this cool enough to play to someone if I like it? It's like actually if you like it, you like it.
Yeah,
That's how it should be. There's no
but
such thing as
also,
a guilty pleasure. It's always just pleasure, right?
yes, exactly. He once said to me, "I love that song more than a Woman by the Bee Gees. I just have always loved that song."
Hmm.
And I grew up with Saturday Night Fever, which I loved. Then
Hmm.
I had to reject it because I was too cool.
Uh-huh.
Then I listened to it again. I'm like, oh my God, it's so good. The music is just phenomenal. And so he wasn't afraid to say things like that. Like when you
Yeah.
listen to More Than a Woman, I honestly blast it loud,
Mm.
and it's unreal how good it is.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, also like there, I'm not going to mention names. Cool DJs and producers who are putting stuff out, and everyone's playing it. You're like,
Hmm.
no, that sounds like one long intro, or no, the bass is wrong in the mix.
Yeah.
And like I would really start, or that's just kind of bringing me down,
Yeah.
that sense of joy. Like, I started to really listen to things differently for a loft dance floor,
Yeah. Yeah.
and just in general, I think I bring that to my work no matter where I am, anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. And those kind of like listening parties, those listening sessions in terms of trying to work out, were you trying to work out what you were going to potentially play at the loft, or was it more a free
Yeah, both.
flowing, like, oh, I'm just going to see what the crowd are going to accept?
No, when David was over here, we were listening to records. It was for the party.
Mm,
So
hmm.
like I'd be playing him stuff that he may not have known, whether it was old or new. And then he would bring over some new stuff to say, have you heard this yet?
Hmm.
And my friend Will Lynn in New York was helping him at the time, DJ Will, who's a great DJ. And he's kind of like my little brother. And Will was really the one that was turning him on to the DFA stuff. So it was really cool because,
Hmm.
David could be very edgy. Some of the older lofties were like, David didn't play electronic music. Oh, yes, he did. Yes, he did, actually. You can't really pigeonhole him.
Yeah.
People call him the godfather of disco. He hated that. Absolutely
Yeah.
hated that.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's just a great person. And I learned so much from him and feel very lucky.
So we were talking about David Mancuso before we had our various tech issues,
Hmm.
and based on that conversation, I'd like to fast forward to today, as it's a Tuesday that we're doing this interview, and that means from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. today, you've been hosting your unmissable Balearic Breakfast Show that goes out on Mixcloud Live. And I want to talk about that show specifically because it's got this whole kind of online community vibe around it. It's very, very interactive. It's a real meeting place for people of like-minded musical tastes. It obviously started on Giles Peterson's Worldwide FM. So how did your relationship with Giles start to begin with? And how did the Balearic Breakfast grow from that?
Well, of course, I knew about Giles when I was working at Dance Tracks in New York, and we were selling records that were on Talkin' Loud. And also, we sold a lot of the Nuyorican Soul album. And I remember before I moved over, Louis said to me, I need to introduce you to Giles. Louis Vega said, I need to introduce you to Giles. You should be on the radio, blah, 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 blah. I didn't actually meet Giles. I went to Bar Roomba a couple times, but I never really got to know him until I actually had him up on a classic album Sundays about Sun Ra.
Mm-hmm.
And then we kind of started to get to know one another. And when he launched Worldwide FM, he did ask if I wanted to do a show. I was one of the first DJs he asked to join.
Mm-hmm.
And originally, I just wanted to do classic album Sundays because I don't say I was phasing out my DJ career, but I felt like after I had a child, that my DJ career hadn't reached the heights that it had reached earlier. Let's put it that way, in a nicer
Different
way to put it.
right?
Well,
Yeah.
It's also people forgot about me, quite frankly. That's this is 20 years ago, and there wasn't a kind of people weren't proactively looking to book women DJs. And even though I have been playing since the 80s and kind of knew everyone, it's just the way it was. And so I started Classic Album Sundays, and I kind of put all my energy into that. So when Giles first asked me onto Worldwide FM, I said I only wanted to do Classic Album Sundays. And he said, no, I think you should do Cosmodelica too. And so I did. And the show, started to gain some traction. And then I did a boiler room. So the DJ career thing started kind of happening again.
Yeah.
And as we got into the pandemic, Giles and I were, I believe, the only two DJs early on who could broadcast live. And I'm a radio broadcaster first and foremost. As I mentioned earlier, I've been broadcasting for, since I was 14, so over 40 years. And when you're a broadcaster, you love to broadcast live.
Yeah.
I don't like pre-records, and it feels stiff. It doesn't feel natural. It's kind of like going to a DJ gig with a pre-recorded set.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah.
I like being in the moment, and you may not be technically perfect.
Yeah.
But there's more energy and there's more connection. And that's what broadcasting is for me. And that's what sharing music is all about for me. It's that connection with people. So as I was broadcasting live from home during the pandemic, I had a captive audience.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I did all of my shows. I didn't even have any means in which to play digital. I only had turntables. So I started a series of request shows, but it had to be genres that I had a lot of records in. And because I only had turntables, I didn't even have a CDJ at home at that time. So I did a lot of request shows. There was a lot of interaction. I was streaming live and interacting with people on the chat. Plus I was doing video and just going the extra mile in terms of even the video. My husband and I put green screen around. He learned OBS Studio. We were doing effects. We made it visually interesting because there were so many people that were going on and doing DJ mixes from their laptop, and it's just some guy sitting in a studio playing tunes on his laptop, which I'm sorry, it's just not engaging.
No.
I would have just put on put a slide on. So I was trying to think of ways to make it engaging, as was my husband. And it just, the radio broadcasts kind of took a life of their own.
Yeah.
When Giles went away in the summer, he had to give up his morning shows. He let other people kind of take them over for the summer. And I did a show on Tuesday mornings, and I called it Summer Staycation because I, like a lot of other people, I didn't go anywhere for a year and a half. I didn't get on a plane and leave the country.
Yeah.
Or over. And it did really well. And then when he came back in September, he said, just keep the show. So I obviously had to change the title because I could no longer call it Summer Staycation.
Mm-hmm.
And I put the word out to the community. And
Mm-hmm.
Balearic Breakfast was one of the titles that came back. And it seemed at the time to tick a lot of boxes in terms of it was a morning show. The
Yeah.
words went well together. And
Mm-hmm.
there was a feeling of going on a mental holiday, which is something we all needed. And the word Balearic kind of gave that connotation and feeling of going away outside the confines of your own house. And
Mm-hmm.
plus, it was musically open ended. It didn't relate to a specific genre. I mean, I know that there's certain groups of British people who feel that Balearic is one sound, but to me, it isn't. And I'm a
No,
rule breaker, so.
it should just be anything and everything, right? Just certain, like, it's about how you make you feel rather than what it sounds like, I think.
Totally.
Yeah.
And also, because my history is so eclectic, there's things I want to bring out there too. Like on today's show, I played quite a lot of older indie stuff, stuff
Mm-hmm.
that I loved in the past, like Pale Saints on 4AD, The Chills, a New Zealand band. The lead singer, Martin Phillips, just passed away. I played
Mm-hmm.
an old Cure remix. And then I'm playing Aretha Franklin, and then
Yeah.
I'm playing a lot of new stuff like Alice Russell
Mm-hmm.
and some jazz things, and it's all over the spectrum.
Yeah.
And it's quite fun to work it out so that it all flows.
So we've reached the part of the interview where we're going to talk about the tracks for our perfect playlist. And this is the House Culture Perfect Playlist. It exists on Spotify, and every single one of our previous podcast guests have submitted the tracks to this playlist across the 5 different themes that we have. So you've been great to provide yours up front. And, we had a chat before the mics came on. You're a true professional. You've got them written in front of you, which you wouldn't believe the amount of people that don't have that. So thank you very much. And, we'll just go through these individually and, just give a little a splash of color as to why these were the tracks that kind of first popped into your mind when you saw, the theme that we were talking about. We always start off with a catalyst, a tune that kind of opened your ears to electronic music, dance music, house music. And I'm so happy that you chose this particular track because it's an all-time fave of mine and arguably the greatest opening track on any album. Can you tell us what you've
Gosh.
chosen?
Yes, a New Order, Age of Consent from Power, Corruption, and Lies. And let me
Mm-hmm.
tell you, I mean, even thinking about it, I'm starting to get teary eyed. This is like the song that, gosh, kind of just brings me straight back to that time. I could dance to it. It was still a bit, had those post punk roots, but was looking more towards dance music. It was electronic music, but it had guitars and bass. And it was just, it's just a euphoric song for me, actually. When I think of John Peel, he loved Teenage Kicks by
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
Undertones.
Mm-hmm.
This is mine, Age of Consent.
Yeah.
And this is the one that just puts me into that time and place in my teens and dancing around my bedroom and no one else in my town knowing this song as well. But yeah, it's just amazing. It just gives me
Yeah.
goosebumps.
It's from the very very beginning, and then it's I absolutely love it. Okay, a floor filler, and I have been lucky enough to hear you play this as well. You've chosen Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, the Love I Lost.
Yeah.
Why that
I
one?
mean, all of the Philly International stuff is
Mm-hmm.
just great. When you look back at what that studio, Sigma Sound Studios and Gamble and Huff, and the writers and arrangers, they had people like Dexter Wenzel, the players that they had like Earl Young, who actually invented the disco kind
Mm-hmm.
of drum beat with the four to the floor kick and the snare and the hi-hats on the eighth note hi-hats. The arrangements, this is professional. And house music, it's very democratic because anyone can make it, because you could just get some, you could do it on your laptop at home, and that's the beauty of it. But it also means you are going to have less traditional song arrangements, and not everything is going to be good. Whereas you could say, anything that's coming out of Philadelphia International or Soul Soul or Motown would be good, at least good, because it's all these pros at the top of their game.
Yeah.
Then you get the ones that are excellent. And number one, Teddy Pendergrass's voice just does it for me. And wow, I mean, what a singer. I mean, he just had it.
Yeah.
And this is just such a bittersweet, euphoric song. I mean, I remember I did play this at Worldwide Festival, and it was the Dimitri's re-edit that he did, where it starts off a cappella, and I just had the lighting guy turn all the lights off, and people just started going mad because, well, first of all, the vocal can carry it, and the playing is so uplifting. Plus, A Floor Filler is a song that everybody knows. And, I can play Train Spotterish stuff, but I've always balanced it with things that people know. And I think that's kind of one thing that I do with my radio shows and my DJ sets. There's things that people know and things that they don't know. And this one, everywhere I've played it, people just love it. And I have to say the Brits in particular love it. I think it's that British reserve just kind of comes out. It just, dissipates on the dance floor, and people just give it their all, and they absolutely love it. And it's just, I never get sick of it, but I do have to make myself stop playing certain songs as well.
No, it's a sensational track. Yeah. And like you say, that Dimitri edit of it is absolutely incredible. Okay. A Sunsetter, a track to soundtrack a sunset. What have you chosen?
Well, I did Kate Bush, Sunset. I thought that would be a good one. I mean, Kate Bush is a very important artist to me. She was not big in the United States at all,
Really? I didn't know that.
The first time the only kind of success she really had was with Hounds of Love. And I was working in a record shop then. So, and we had that on our playlist at the record shop. So I knew that really well, but I had also discovered Lionheart through one of my aunts. So I was telling you that some of my aunts and uncles turned me on to music, and I had one aunt who was into, kind of different stuff. And Kate Bush, she's a very English artist. So she didn't necessarily translate well to the American audience necessarily. But then she kind of went away in the 90s, and she had a child. And then when she had a child, she kind of withdrew from music a little bit. But then she came back with this album, Ariel. And Ariel was released in 2005, basically exactly a year after I had a baby. And it's a double album. And then she's singing about things like the washing machine. And I can't tell you how much laundry I did after. You have an infant, and you're like, how do they get through so much clothes, And they really you're just always doing the laundry. And there's just certain things, the domesticity of it, but still with this kind of great cosmic kind of free Kate Bush vibe. I mean, I was lucky to see her performance as well. I did go. I went to opening night when she did her run of shows. But Sunset's a beautiful song, and I have played it on Balearic Breakfast as well. But she's just she's just such an incredible artist and someone who I hugely admire.
Yeah, she's absolutely incredible. And there's another incredible female artist you've chosen for your tearjerker, a song that fills you full of emotion.
Yeah, she's another one of my favorite artists, Joni Mitchell. I really feel she really changed the fabric of popular music with her guitar tunings, but also her poetic lyrics and also her melodies. Her melodies don't go where you think they are going to go. And she wrote this song called Little Green, which is on her album Blue. And when Joni Mitchell was married, actually Mitchell's her married name. Her maiden name is my middle name, Anderson. That's my mother's maiden name. But she had a daughter in the late 60s, probably around the time I was born. And when her and her husband split, she knew that she couldn't have a career or even take care of her daughter as a single mother, and trying to, make a life as a musician, because she wasn't a popular musician at that point. She couldn't make a living. She was hard enough to pay the rent. So she actually gave her daughter up, and she didn't just give her up like, some people had children and they would give them up immediately. And so maybe didn't have those ties already.
Yeah.
But she already had this mother-daughter bond. And she just felt my daughter's going to have a better life without me.
Mm-hmm.
And I just can't even imagine what that was like, or being in her shoes. And I don't judge her. I'm sure a lot of people do. And I know that I think she did reconnect with her daughter. I don't think her daughter was that happy with her. And, I'm not making any judgments here. It's not my call. And also, I wasn't a singer-songwriter at the beginning of my career in the late 1960s as a woman. So I don't think unless you were, that you could make any judgment, really. But she starts to sing about her daughter and what she might be doing right now. And it's just, as a parent, I'm starting to break up just talking about it. As a parent, you really feel it. You really feel it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's got such a backstory, that song. I know exactly what you're talking about. Okay, a last tune on a more positive note. It's the Studio Rio version of
Bill Withers' Lovely Day. And it's like, I just played this recently as the last song. I played it a few times recently. It's one of my more recent ones because I just got it through Mr. Bongo. And everyone knows the original, and it's such a great song. Everyone knows the words. It makes everybody feel great, and you want people to leave a night feeling good, or leaving a set. And I just think it's a great last song. You can talk about the morning and the sun's coming up. I played it last week. I was playing on a Wednesday morning from 3 to 6 a.m. in the Netherlands, like not even in Amsterdam. So it was like 6 a.m. when I played this song. And it's just a beautiful, and then with the Brazilian band, the Studio Rio band, it just sounds fantastic. But there's a lot of different other last songs, like, As is quite a traditional one for the Loft, or it depends on where you are, but that's just something that just works everywhere.
Send them out with a smile always.
Exactly.
I mean, a funny story actually. When I saw you play at the Hacienda event at the Tobacco Dock a couple of years ago, you completely freaked me out. I don't know if you remember this or not, because I was at the front, and at the very end of your set, the lights went up and you clapped everyone and said, "Thank you very much. Now we've all got to sing happy birthday to this man." And you pointed at me, and it was a complete case of mistaken identity, apparently. The whole room sang me happy birthday. But the weirdest,
your birthday.
The weirdest thing was, it was actually my birthday 2 days before that. So I was, it
funny.
Freaked me out. I thought I was being like pranked somehow. But anyway, I didn't know whether to tell you this story or not, or to embarrass you, but I thought it'd make you laugh. That's hilarious.
Well, that's a good last song. When it's someone's birthday, you can just sing them happy birthday.
Well, yeah, indeed. Cool. Okay. Well,
it'll always be somebody's birthday, right?
It will always be somebody's birthday. Yeah. And we've done the last song, and this is the final question of the interview as well. Just before before we wrap everything up, this is the House Culture podcast, and obviously we are House Culture, and we're all about not only about house music. It's all about the art, the personalities, the scene, the actual culture of the movement that we find ourselves in terms of dance music, electronic music, house music. When someone says the term kind of house culture, and you look at the scene as a cultural entity, what are the kind of major tenets of it for you? How do you see it?
Community. When it was really, when I was doing my radio shows and playing at these house clubs in New York in the 90s, I listened back to a radio show. I had a lot of guests up, like Little Lewis and all these different people, and had Rome Anthony up. And Roman and I were just talking about how great house music was because it brought all these people together. And that's what it felt like to me. Like it just united all these people And it didn't matter like what age you were, because in New York we had a longer tradition, because you had all the old kind of garage and the heads from the 1970s are now part of the house music scene, is along with people like myself. I was in my 20s at that time. It didn't matter what race you were, what your sexual orientation was, gender. It just unified people on the dance floor. It was so celebratory. And also the fact that it was so democratic as well. Like, as I was saying before, you didn't have to be like a classically trained musician, or you didn't have to, like, I know Larry Hurd obviously was a jazz keyboardist. You could be someone like Larry Hurd. At the same time, you could be someone like Juan Atkins, who's just like, I have a synthesizer. What can I do with it? So it was very open for all different levels. You had very orchestrated stuff or very minimal stuff. And it just seemed to bring so many people together. And in New York, it was so great. Like going to, I know we talked about the Loft, but I was going to the Shelter all the time. The Shelter was great. It was so good in the early 90s. It was just this feeling of unity, and then kind of Body and Soul took that kind of feeling as well. It was that they were both held at vinyl. And I remember people discovering house music through my radio show, because of course it's at 89.1 FM. It's on the FM dials, and they would say, I've never heard this music before. What is this called? And it was just infectious, it could be very spiritual as well. It could be very sexual. It could just be fun, very deep. But the community aspect of how it brought so many different people together, and what we felt like on the dance floor, that's what it was for me.
Well, what a place to end on. Thank you so much for taking part.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.